There is a kind of suffering that doesn't look like suffering from the outside. No visible wounds, no dramatic crisis, no obvious reason to complain. Just a life that works, bills paid, routine intact, nothing catastrophically wrong, and yet something underneath it all that aches in a way that's almost impossible to explain to someone who hasn't felt it. It is the specific, quiet agony of a person living significantly below what they are capable of. And the cruelest part is that the world will never tell you something is wrong, because from where everyone else is standing, everything looks just fine. Henderson looked just fine for a very long time. He had what most people would call a decent life. A steady job in a mid-sized company where he had worked for 9 years, a small apartment he had furnished carefully, a routine that moved him predictably from Monday to Friday without too much friction. He wasn't unhappy exactly, but Henderson wasn't alive in the way he sometimes remembered being alive, back when he had wanted things urgently, back when the future had felt like an open field rather than a corridor with walls closing slowly inward. Somewhere in his early 30s, Henderson had made a deal with himself that he never consciously agreed to. He had traded the size of his life for the safety of it, stopped pursuing the kind of work that actually lit something in him because it felt too uncertain, too exposed, too far from guaranteed. Stopped raising his hand for the bigger opportunities because the smaller ones came with less risk of public failure. Stopped dreaming with any real conviction because dreaming too hard and falling short had hurt him once, and once had been enough. So Henderson kept his head down, did good work inside a small box, and called it responsibility. The bottom came on a Tuesday, which is somehow always when the real ones come. Henderson was sitting in a performance review 9 years in, reliable record, steady contributions. And his manager was saying warm, appreciative things about his consistency. And Henderson sat there listening to himself being praised for being consistent, and felt something inside him collapse quietly and completely. Because consistency had never been the dream. Consistency was what was left after the dream had been carefully, methodically packed away. He drove home that evening in a silence that felt different from his usual silence, heavier, more honest. And Henderson did something he hadn't done in years. He let himself actually feel the full weight of where he was, not the managed, filtered version he usually allowed through. The real weight. 9 years, the same desk, the same ceiling. The same Henderson, smaller every year, not because life had beaten him down, but because he had been beating himself down preemptively, quietly, consistently, to avoid any chance of a bigger fall. He sat in his car in the parking garage for 40 minutes and did not move. That night Henderson pulled out an old hard drive, the kind of instinctive, unplanned gesture that turns out to matter enormously. He was looking for nothing specific, but what he found were files from his late 20s. Design concepts, written pitches, half-finished projects bursting with an ambition and creative confidence that made him feel like he was reading someone else's work. Someone bolder. Someone who had not yet learned to be so careful with himself. Henderson stared at those files for a long time, and then, for the first time in years, he let himself grieve, really grieve, the years he had spent playing so far beneath what he was capable of, not with self-pity, with honesty, because you cannot rebuild from a place you haven't had the courage to fully acknowledge. The grief didn't last forever, but it did its necessary work. And when Henderson came out the other side of it, something had shifted in his foundation. The fear was still there, it never fully leaves, but it had been joined by something stronger. A refusal. A quiet, firm, deeply personal refusal to sit at that desk in 10 more years and feel what he had felt on that Tuesday. That refusal became the first real fuel Henderson had run on in almost a decade. He didn't overhaul his life overnight, but he started making different choices, smaller than they sound but enormous in what they represented. He reached back out to people in his field whose work he respected. He started a project on evenings and weekends that had no guaranteed outcome, but made him feel like himself again. He began taking up the space he had spent years shrinking out of. And slowly, The corridor with the closing walls began to open back into something that felt, finally, like a field. Here is the hidden cost of playing small that nobody puts into words clearly enough. It is not just the opportunities you miss. It is not just the income or the recognition or the external markers of a bigger life. The real cost is internal. It is what happens to a person, to their sense of self, their aliveness, their private relationship with their own potential, after years of deliberately living below it. You do not stay neutral when you play small. You slowly lose the belief that you were ever meant for anything larger. And that belief, once lost, is the hardest thing in the world to find again. Don't wait until a Tuesday in a parking garage to start taking yourself seriously. The life you are capable of is not arrogance. It is not irresponsibility. It is not selfishness. It is the whole point. Stop negotiating it away before anyone else even gets the chance to. If this story moved you, subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear it today.